The Xel'vari dominion had ruled for millennia, its authority unquestioned. No species had ever dared to challenge it. When reports surfaced of an unknown fleet appearing at the fringes of their core systems, the Imperial War Council barely paid attention. Another upstart race, they thought. Another species that had yet to learn its place. But then the first planet-killer cannon fired. Aboard the Imperial Command Station Xel'vari, High Admiral Varesh watched the battle screen with narrowed eyes. The human fleet had just dropped out of FTL, dark monolithic ships blotting out the stars. Their hulls shimmered with unknown alloys, and their formation was unnervingly perfect. Then came the first act of war. The Xel'vari's external sensors flared as a beam of searing white light lanced across the void. The station shields, designed to withstand the firepower of entire fleets, flickered for a fraction of a second, then failed. There was no explosion. No debris. No wreckage. Just nothing. The station and the 20,000 Xel'vari aboard it had ceased to exist. Silence filled the War Council chamber. Then the alarms began blaring. Varesh shot to his feet. What in the void was that? Across the room, Lord General Zarek's mandibles clicked in agitation. Impossible. No weapon has that kind of yield. The battle screens adjusted, showing the human fleet advancing, slow and deliberate. The Dominion's defense forces scrambled to respond, sending interceptors and warships to engage. Varesh allowed himself a breath of relief. The humans would now face the full strength of the Empire's navy. Then the second attack came. Unlike the first, this wasn't a single devastating strike. Hundreds of human warships fired in unison. It wasn't energy-based, nor was it projectile-based in any way they understood. The Xel'vari ships began vanishing, erased from existence. The Dominion fleet had barely deployed when entire squadrons disappeared mid-maneuver. Panic spread through the command center like wildfire. They're wiping out ships before we even registered their weapons fire. No, there's no impact. There's no residual energy. They're just gone. Varesh's mandibles clenched. This wasn't a battle. This was extermination. He slammed a fist onto the control panel. Get me the Emperor! Aboard the TSF Revenant. Admiral Elias Voss stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes locked onto the tactical display. His fleet moved like a precise, well-oiled machine. The Xel'vari were reacting exactly as predicted, slow, overconfident, and completely unprepared for human technology. Status report, Voss said, his voice calm. Commander Rain, his second-in-command, gave a tight nod. 32 enemy capital ships destroyed. Defense platforms eliminated. Their primary command station has been neutralized. Voss exhaled slowly. Years of preparation, of watching humanity suffer in exile, had led to this moment. They had been dismissed as insignificant, ignored as they built their war machine in the dark. Now, the Dominion faced the consequences of that arrogance. They still think this is a battle, Rain muttered. They haven't realized it's already over. They will. Voss turned to his communications officer. Broadcast on all Dominion channels. A pause. Then a confirming nod. You're live, sir. Voss stepped forward, his voice steady as steel. To the Xel'vari Dominion, you cast humanity out. You saw us as weak, unworthy of existence. You thought we would perish. But we survived. We adapted. We grew stronger. And now we have returned. He let the words settle before continuing. There is no negotiation. There is no surrender. Only justice. The Dominion ends today. He gestured, and the fleet resumed its advance. Xel'vari High Command, Imperial Palace, Throne World Zelkaris. Archlord Xel'vari stood before the massive war map, his golden robes flowing as he paced. The reports were clear, unbelievably so. The humans were advancing uncontested. Entire fleets erased. Worlds defenseless. This is madness, he hissed. His advisors were equally shaken. Minister Julek's voice trembled. We cannot fight an enemy that defies the laws of war itself. Xel'vari's golden eyes burned with fury. They are primitives. We are the Dominion. Varesh's face appeared on the central display, his expression grim. My lord, we have underestimated them. Our ships, our weapons, they are meaningless against what they wield. Xel'vari leaned forward. Then tell me, Admiral, how do we stop them? Silence. Varesh exhaled. I do not know if we can. Battlefront, Xel'vari Prime Defense Fleet. The last of the Dominion's core fleet engaged the human armada near the capital world. Hundreds of Xel'vari warships, once the terror of the galaxy, formed their final defensive line. Admiral Varesh sat in his command chair aboard the Dominion Wrath, watching the scanners with growing dread. His forces outnumbered the humans 3-1, yet not a single ship had landed a successful strike. Target their lead battleship, he ordered. A barrage of antimatter warheads streaked toward the Revenant, and disintegrated mid-flight. No counterfire, no interception. They simply ceased to exist. Then the human fleet retaliated. A blinding arc of energy split the void. The Dominion Wrath shuddered as the deck beneath Varesh's feet trembled. He barely had time to process it before half his fleet vanished from the displays. No wreckage. No survivors. Panic erupted across the bridge. Shields are down! Hull integrity! A final flash. Then nothing. The aftermath. The battle lasted precisely 42 minutes. By the time the last Xel'vari warship fell silent, only one message echoed across the Dominion's emergency frequencies. Xel'vari Prime is defenseless. On the bridge of the Revenant, Admiral Voss stood motionless as the sight of the Xel'vari homeworld filled the viewport. The planet had once been the heart of an empire that had ruled the stars with an iron fist. Now its mighty fleets were dust, its defenses in ruins. Commander Rain stepped forward. Orders, sir? Voss took a deep breath. We finish this. And the human fleet advanced toward the heart of the Dominion. The Xel'vari Dominion had never known fear. For thousands of years, their rule had been absolute, their enemies crushed before they could even dream of rebellion. But now, a single name spread like wildfire across the stars: humanity. And with that name came terror. Xel'vari Prime, Imperial Palace. Archlord Xel'vari stared at the battle reports, his golden eyes unblinking. The numbers were meaningless. A fleet lost. A planet defenseless. A war already decided before it had begun. The impossible had become reality. His advisors surrounded him, their voices frantic. The humans have broken the defense line. Hundreds of warships lost. Their technology makes no sense. We can't counter it. Xel'vari slammed a clawed hand onto the war table. The chamber fell silent. He looked to the only officer who hadn't spoken, High Admiral Varesh's replacement, Commander Ketzer. Tell me, Xel'vari said, his voice low, dangerous. Is there any hope? Ketzer hesitated. If we abandon all outlying systems, we could consolidate forces. Abandon? The Archlord's voice echoed through the chamber. You speak of surrender. We speak of survival. Minister Julek interjected. The humans are not fighting a war. They are exterminating us. A tense silence followed. Xel'vari turned away, looking at the grand imperial banners hanging above. Once, they had symbolized dominion over the stars. Now, they felt like relics of a dying age. His empire was falling. Aboard the TSF Revenant, human command ship, Admiral Elias Voss stood at the observation deck, watching the blue-green orb of Xel'vari Prime. The enemy's homeworld was within striking distance, its orbital defenses nothing more than debris. A planet that had ruled over billions now sat vulnerable before him. Commander Rain stepped forward. Intercepted communications confirm it, sir. The Empire is crumbling. Entire fleets are deserting. Governors are abandoning their posts. Voss nodded, unsurprised. They spent centuries ruling through fear. Now that fear is turning inward. Some of their nobles are trying to negotiate. Rain scoffed. Pathetic. They'd rather sell out their own kind than face justice. Voss turned to the tactical display. The plan was proceeding as expected. The Xel'vari weren't just losing, they were unraveling. Without their fleets, their core systems had no defense. Without their government, their empire was leaderless. "Send a message to all human ships," Voss said. "No delays. We keep advancing." Xel'vari core worlds, chaos and despair. Panic gripped the heart of the empire. Civil unrest erupted across once orderly cities. On Vel-Zyrith, the governor abandoned the planet, fleeing with his personal fleet. He was shot down by his own officers before he could escape. On Garanik, riots tore through the streets. Military garrisons, once symbols of Xel'vari dominance, were overrun by mobs of terrified citizens. Some Xel'vari tried to flee, boarding ships bound for the uncharted void. Most never made it out. The news was the same everywhere. The Empire was collapsing under its own weight. Aboard the Xel'vari battlecruiser Vengeance, Commander Ketzer stood on the bridge, watching as his fleet drifted in silence. His orders had been clear: hold the line. But against what? Against an enemy they couldn't fight? Against ships that turned their proud war machines into dust? His officers looked to him for direction. Some whispered of surrender. Others of running. But where could they go? A censor officer called out, voice shaking. "Incoming human fleet." Ketzer straightened. He had known this moment would come. He had seen the wreckage of their mightiest warships, watched as entire fleets had vanished without so much as a struggle. "Open a channel," he ordered. A moment later, Admiral Voss's image appeared on the holoscreen. His expression was unreadable. Ketzer drew himself up. "We wish to negotiate." Voss's voice was ice. "There is nothing to negotiate." Ketzer clenched his fists. "You've won. The Empire is broken. What more do you want?" Voss's stare didn't waver. "Justice." The channel cut off. Moments later, the first human's salvo struck. The Vengeance never had a chance. Xel'vari Prime, the Emperor's last gamble. Desperation clawed at Xel'vari's mind. He had ruled for centuries, shaped history with his own hands. And now, his legacy was crumbling. He paced through his war chamber, his generals standing in fearful silence. "If they reach this planet, we are finished." "They will reach this planet," Minister Gillek corrected. The Archlord's claws scraped against the marble floor. "Then we will make them pay for every inch." "We have no fleet left," another general muttered. Xel'vari ignored him. "Deploy every last soldier. Every weapon. Every ship. We will not fall quietly." The room fell into uneasy silence. They all knew the truth. There was no defense left. No strategy, no hope. But the Archlord would rather die fighting than face the shame of defeat. Outside the palace, Xel'vari Prime burned. Aboard the Revenant, the final orders. Voss stood in the command center, surrounded by the glow of tactical readouts. The Xel'vari homeworld filled the viewport. This was it. The endgame. "Their last forces are rallying for a final stand," Rain reported. "It won't matter." Voss exhaled slowly. For centuries, humanity had been treated as insects, cast aside, ignored, hunted. The Xel'vari had never believed they would rise again. Now, the last remnants of their empire were at his mercy. He turned to his officers. "Prepare for planetary assault." The final strike was about to begin. The sky over Xel'vari Prime darkened. Not from clouds, not from the smoke of burning cities, but from the vast human armada that blotted out the heavens. The last bastion of the Dominion, the heart of the Empire, stood on the brink. For centuries, Xel'vari Prime had never known invasion. Its defenses had been built with the arrogance of a species that believed itself untouchable. Planetary shields, orbital fortresses, vast legions of elite warriors, none of it had ever been tested. Until now. Aboard the TSF Revenant, Admiral Elias Voss stood at the bridge, watching the projections. The planet below was already unraveling. Civil unrest, looting, cities in flames. Even before the first human drop pods hit the surface, the Xel'vari were tearing themselves apart. "They're sending a final transmission," Commander Rain reported. Voss nodded. Patch it through. The holoscreen flickered, and the regal yet haggard face of Archlord Xel'vari appeared. The once mighty ruler of the Dominion looked worn, his golden robes smeared with soot. The throne room behind him was in shambles. This war is madness, the Archlord said, his voice tight with desperation. You have proven your strength. But there is still time to end this. Let us negotiate peace. Voss's expression remained unreadable. Peace? Xel'vari straightened. Yes. A truce. A chance to. There was no truce when you hunted us. Voss interrupted, his voice even. No mercy when you burned our worlds. Xel'vari's mandibles clicked. We can. No. Voss's tone was final. The transmission cut. Rain exhaled sharply. I almost feel sorry for them. Voss turned back to the viewport. They don't deserve your pity. He turned to the tactical officer. Begin the assault. The sky ignited as human warships opened fire. Xel'vari Prime, capital city. The first explosions shattered the skyline. Towers that had stood for centuries crumbled as precision orbital strikes ripped through key military outposts. Air defense cannons flared to life, but their firepower was nothing against the sheer force of human weaponry. The streets became a battlefield. The Xel'vari had deployed their final soldiers, but morale had already collapsed. Entire battalions surrendered before the first shot was fired. Others fought with desperation, knowing there would be no reinforcements. And then the drop pods arrived. Screaming from the upper atmosphere, the Terran shock troopers hit the ground like meteors. Their impact sent shockwaves through the city streets, crushing vehicles and sending debris flying. Sergeant Mira Kane unlatched her harness as the pod's doors burst open. Her squad moved out with lethal precision, their exocets absorbing the impact of their descent. Kane raised her rifle, scanning the chaos. Xel'vari troops were already scrambling, their formations breaking under the relentless human advance. Push forward, she ordered. Her squad surged ahead, weapons roaring. Plasma rounds cut through enemy armor, sending Xel'vari warriors sprawling. They weren't just winning, they were overwhelming them. A group of Xel'vari soldiers tried to rally at a barricade, their officers barking commands. Kane's visor tagged them instantly. Grenade out! A micro-explosive arced through the air, landing squarely in the center of the formation. The detonation was instant, armor shredded, bodies thrown. The survivors turned to run. This wasn't a battle. It was a purge. Xel'vari Imperial Palace, throne room. Xel'vari could hear the gunfire approaching. The mighty hall of the Dominion's rulers, once a place of power, now felt like a tomb. His elite guards stood ready, but even they knew the truth. The enemy was coming. The palace doors would not hold. He turned to his ministers. Any word from our fleets? Xel'vari swallowed hard. There are no fleets. Xel'vari's grip tightened. What about our ground forces? Xel'vari lowered his gaze. Falling. Everywhere. The great empire, built over thousands of years, was disintegrating before his eyes. Then, the palace doors exploded inward. A wave of human soldiers stormed through, weapons raised. The Imperial Guards fired, but they were cut down in seconds. Xel'vari backed away as a figure strode through the smoke, Admiral Elias Voss. For the first time in his life, the Archlord felt true fear. Voss stopped a few feet away, his rifle at ease but ready. His dark uniform was unblemished, his expression unreadable. Xel'vari forced himself to stand tall. So, this is how humanity fights? No honor. No mercy. Voss met his gaze. Mercy is for those who deserve it. The Archlord sneered. We could have coexisted. Voss took a step forward. No. You had your chance. He raised his weapon. And now your empire dies. A single shot rang out. Xel'vari crumpled to the floor, the golden banners of his empire falling around him. Xel'vari Prime, the aftermath. By nightfall, the planet belonged to humanity. The last remnants of the Xel'vari military surrendered. Civilians, once terrified, knelt before their new conquerors. From orbit, the once proud capital was barely recognizable. Fires burned, ruins stretched for miles. The Dominion, which had ruled the stars for eons, had been reduced to rubble in a single day. Aboard the Revenant, Admiral Voss stood in silence, watching the smoldering planet below. The war was over. But the message had just begun. The embers of Xel'vari Prime still glowed, casting eerie shadows over a world that had once ruled the stars. The great banners of the Dominion lay trampled beneath the boots of human soldiers. The war was over. Humanity had won. But victory was just the beginning. Aboard the TSF Revenant, War Council, Admiral Elias Voss sat at the head of the strategy table, surrounded by his officers. The holographic display showed the galactic map, red Xel'vari territories now overlaid with Terran occupation markers. Commander Rain folded her arms. The last Imperial strongholds have fallen. The Xel'vari homeworld is secure. Voss studied the display. Entire planets had surrendered without a fight after the fall of their capital. Some Xel'vari governors had already sworn loyalty to humanity in exchange for survival. Others had fled into deep space, remnants of a fallen empire clinging to the illusion of resistance. We need to ensure there's nothing left of their rule, Voss said. No resurgence. No rebellion. General Holt, a grizzled veteran of the campaign, nodded. We start by dismantling what remains of their military infrastructure. There were factories, their shipyards, gone. Rain hesitated. And the civilians? Voss exhaled. They have a choice. Accept human governance, or leave. The days of Xel'vari rule are over. The room was silent for a moment. Everyone knew what this meant. They weren't just defeating an empire, they were replacing it. Rain broke the silence. What about their nobility? Some have sent envoys asking for negotiations. Voss's expression hardened. No negotiations. They built their empire on the suffering of others. They don't get to walk away. A moment later, a junior officer stepped forward. Sir, we've received a transmission from the Xel'vari remnants. They call themselves the True Dominion. They refuse to accept defeat. Voss's gaze didn't waver. Send a message back. The officer nodded. What should it say? Voss's voice was cold. Run. Hide. It won't matter. Xel'vari Prime, the occupied capital. The streets that had once echoed with the proud steps of imperial warriors now trembled beneath the weight of human boots. The palace was no longer a symbol of dominance. It was a fortress of occupation. Sergeant Mira Kane walked through the ruined city, her squad flanking her. She could feel the eyes of the Xel'vari civilians watching from the shattered buildings, silent, afraid, broken. They're terrified of us, Private Harlan muttered. Kane glanced at a group of Xel'vari children peeking from behind a collapsed statue. Good. They should be. But not all the civilians cowered. Some glared with quiet defiance. Some still believed in the Empire, even as its ashes crumbled around them. A calm signal chimed in her helmet. Kane, came her commander's voice. We have an issue. She tapped her comm. Go ahead. Pockets of resistance. Former palace guards. They refuse to surrender. Kane sighed. Location? Imperial District. They're making a last stand. She turned to her squad. You heard that. Let's finish this. The Imperial District. Last stand of the Xel'vari. The former palace guard had barricaded themselves inside an old war museum. Statues of past emperors stood in the courtyard, now riddled with bullet holes. Kane and her squad moved in swiftly. Their exocets made them near invincible against the Xel'vari's outdated weaponry. Shots rang out as resistance fighters fired desperately from behind overturned monuments. Plasma bursts lit up the night. Kane's soldiers returned fire with ruthless efficiency. She moved forward, ducking behind cover. A Xel'vari officer lunged at her, wielding a ceremonial blade. Kane sidestepped and drove her rifle into his gut, pulling the trigger. The fight lasted only minutes. When the last Xel'vari fell, Kane surveyed the battlefield. The resistance was over. One of the surviving Xel'vari, wounded but still conscious, looked up at her. His mandibles clicked weakly. You will never rule us. Cain met his gaze. You already serve us. His eyes burned with hatred. But there was nothing he could do. She turned away. The battle was done. Aboard the Revenant, the future of the galaxy. Voss stood at the viewport, staring at the planet below. A world that had once ruled the stars now belonged to humanity. Rain approached. The Xel'vari remnants are scattering. Some have gone into hiding. Others are trying to form resistance cells. Voss didn't look at her. And the rest? She hesitated. Most are surrendering. They know there's no future for them as an empire. Voss nodded. Good. There was no joy in victory. No celebration. This war hadn't been about glory, it had been about survival. Humanity had suffered under the Dominion for too long. Now, the balance had shifted. Rain's voice softened. What now? Voss turned to her. Now we rebuild. We reshape the galaxy. Humanity had won. The Xel'vari Dominion was dead. And from its ashes, a new empire would rise.